It's a hell of a dark world. Kregon's Dark World presents the terrifying trials of Mathew Witty. Mathew Witty was a man on the edge, constantly plagued by the haunting memories of his time in the war. His mind was a battlefield of its own, always fighting against the demons that lurked in the corners of his thoughts. He was driving down a dark and deserted road, the rain pounding down like 1,000 fists from the heavens. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated a horrific scene in front of him. A car crash. The twisted and mangled metal, the shattered glass, and the sound of screams echoed through the air. With a shudder, Mathew realized that he recognized the car. It was his own. As he stepped out of the car, the smell of blood and gasoline assaulted his senses. His heart racing, he made his way to the driver's seat and his blood ran cold. The driver was his wife, her body contorted and broken, a gruesome smile etched onto her face. Mathew screamed and his voice echoed into the darkness. Suddenly he was surrounded by a group of people, all covered in blood and wearing twisted grins. They pulled him into a nearby building where he found himself in a hospital room. In the center of the room lay a man, his body twisted and mangled beyond recognition. The doctors were frantically working on him, trying to save his life, but it was too late. Mathew recognized the man. It was Wellington Macmillan, the millionaire banker. As Mathew looked around the room, he realized that the people surrounding him were not human. They were demons, their twisted horns and razor-sharp claws glinting in the dim light. They were devouring the remains of Macmillan, tearing apart his body and feasting on his flesh. With a sudden jolt, Mathew woke up, drenched in sweat. He realized it was all just a nightmare, but the terror he felt was all too real. As he stumbled out of bed and into the bathroom, he looked into the mirror and saw that his face was covered in blood. It was then that he realized that the demons were not just in his mind. They were real, and they were coming for him. The room grew dark, and the walls began to close in on him. Mathew screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of demonic laughter. Mathew Witty's heart was pounding in his chest as he entered the dimly lit operating room. He was here to witness the horrors of the ultimate surgical procedure, and he could already feel the cold sweat trickling down his back. The doctors, dressed in blood-stained gowns, welcomed him with whispered introductions. Dr. Remington, Dr. Witty, Dr. Pritchard Mitford, Dr. Witty. "Your book on streptothrombosis was a masterpiece," said Pritchard Mitford, shaking hands. "A bloody masterpiece, sir." "Thank you," said Mathew, his voice quivering with fear. He tried to calm himself by looking at the complicated machine connected to the operating table. Tubes and wires snaked out of it like tentacles, and the rhythmic sounds it made were like the beating of a demonic heart. Suddenly, an intern shouted, "The new anesthetizer is giving away. There is no one in the East who knows how to fix it." Mathew's heart sank as he realized that he was in the midst of a medical nightmare. But then he heard a low, cool voice inside his head urging him to take action. "Quiet, man," he said, channeling his inner hero. He sprang to the machine and began fingering delicately a row of glistening dials. "Give me a fountain pen," he snapped. Someone handed him a fountain pen, and he pulled a faulty piston out of the machine, inserting the pen in its place. "That will hold for 10 minutes," he said. "Get on with the operation." A nurse hurried over and whispered to the lead surgeon, Dr. Renshaw, and Mathew saw the man turn pale. "Choreopsis has set in," said Renshaw nervously. "If you would take over, Witty." Mathew looked at him and then at the other doctors, who were staring at him with fear in their eyes. He knew that he was the only one who could save the patient. Without hesitation, he slipped into a white gown, adjusted a mask, and drew on thin gloves. Nurses handed him shining instruments that glinted in the harsh fluorescent light. As Mathew began to cut into the patient, he could feel the horror creeping up on him like a cold, damp fog. The sound of flesh tearing made his stomach lurch, and the sight of blood gushing out of the incision made him gag. But he knew that he had to keep going. He had to save this poor soul from the clutches of death. As he worked, Mathew could hear strange whispers in the back of his mind. They were voices from another realm, urging him to do unspeakable things, but he pushed them aside and focused on the task at hand. He knew that he was the only one who could save this patient, and he would do whatever it took to succeed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mathew finished the procedure. The patient's vital signs were stable, and the doctors were amazed by his skill. But Mathew knew that he had made a deal with the devil. He had saved a life, but at what cost? The voices in his head were still there, urging him to embrace the darkness and unleash his true power. As he left the operating room, Mathew felt like he was walking through a nightmare. The fluorescent lights flickered like the flames of hell, and the whispers in his mind grew louder and more insistent. He knew that he was no longer the man he used to be. He had become something else. Mathew Witty's mind raced as he walked the desolate streets of Waterbury. Images of blood, gore, and violence danced in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting to pounce. He looked over his shoulder but saw nothing. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned a corner and saw a group of shadowy figures lurking in an alleyway. "Who the fuck are you?" he growled, his hand going to the gun in his pocket. The figures stepped forward, revealing themselves to be a gang of vicious killers. They laughed at him, taunting him with obscene gestures and vulgar language. But Mathew was not afraid. He was a hardened criminal, feared by all who knew him. He drew his gun and fired, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. The gang fell, their bodies littering the pavement in a pool of blood and gore. Mathew continued on, his mind consumed with thoughts of violence and death. He entered an A&P, looking for a specific type of dog biscuit, one that he could use to lure his next victim. The clerk eyed him warily as he made his purchase, sensing something off about this strange man. As Mathew left the store, he saw a woman walking by. Something about her caught his eye, and he followed her at a distance. He watched as she entered a hair salon and waited outside, biding his time. When she emerged, he pounced, grabbing her from behind and dragging her into an alleyway. "What the fuck are you doing?" she screamed, struggling against his grasp. But Mathew was too strong, too determined. He slammed her against the wall, his hand covering her mouth to stifle her cries for help. The alleyway was dark and damp, the perfect place for a murder. Mathew's mind raced with the possibilities as he drew his knife, the sharp blade glinting in the moonlight. He advanced on the woman, his eyes filled with a cold, ruthless determination. But just as he was about to strike, something snapped inside him. He dropped the knife and stumbled away, his hands shaking with fear and confusion. What had he almost done? How had he become this monster? Trembling, Mathew fled the scene, his mind consumed with thoughts of what he had almost done. He knew he needed help, but he was too afraid to seek it out. He was trapped in a cycle of violence and despair with no way out. It's a hell of a dark world in this horror rewrite of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And you know what? It's because the line between reality and fantasy is blurred beyond recognition. Mathew Witty, the protagonist, is tormented by violent visions that blend with his mundane existence, turning even a simple trip to the grocery store into a blood-soaked nightmare. Every moment is filled with suspense and terror, as the boundaries between his delusions and the real world become increasingly indistinguishable. The reader is plunged into a world where sanity is fragile and horrors lurk around every corner. Click like and subscribe for the almighty YouTube algorithm. Gods, it's a hell of a dark world.